I would like to introduce our third speaker for the day. Our third speaker is Ms. Nadja El emotional intelligence coach and consultant from Brussels, Belgium. Nadja is the CEO and founder of Thrive with EQ and is a former senior executive at the NATO. Drawing upon her nearly 2 decades of experience in a variety of leadership and policy planning positions at NATO, she now helps people to thrive instead of surviving in the 21st century. She helps organizations implement the secret to successful workforce development in the digital age. Having closely worked with people from over 40 countries during her tenure at NATO, Nadja is uniquely skilled in fostering trust and understanding among diverse global stakeholders in both the public and private sectors across various industries. She acted as the co-chair of the Transatlantic Steering Committee for Disruptive Dilemmas, Cyber Crisis Simulation Exercise, the largest side event of the GlobeSec 2019 Bratislava Forum, a top 5 international security conference worldwide. Nadja possesses the latest credentials in the emotional intelligence space and has trained with leading experts in the field. She is a licensed neuro-linguistic programming master practitioner, a certified EQI 2.0 coach by Multi-Health System Incorporated Assessments, and a certified digital marketer by the Digital Marketing Institute in Dublin, Ireland. A proven leader, Nadja is an alumna of the 2014 NATO Executive Development Program, an alumna of the 2018 Marshall Memorial Fellow sponsored by the GMF of the United States. She has spoken to international institutions about workforce development in the European Commission, the European Parliament, and at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Paris. She's fluent in English, French, Dutch, and Arabic, and proficient in Italian, and has working knowledge of German. Here to talk about how to build your emotional firewalls and thrive beyond disruptions, Nadja El.
Thank you. I'm not sure I recognize myself in all those listings, but thank you very much for the kind introduction. Can everyone see my screen? So it's not PowerPoint, it's Canva. I'm very honored and privileged to be here today, especially because you may wonder what my background has anything to do with nursing or how can I contribute. I think we have seen even before COVID hit 256 million people across the globe succumbing to burnout, succumbing to stress and pressure. And the World Health Organization named it as an international disease. And then COVID hit and this number went even up, doubled probably. And the health sector, I mean, a lot of sectors, they are facing pandemic burnouts, they're facing high levels of stress, etc. But especially the healthcare sector is struggling. So what I want to contribute with my knowledge, with my experience, with myself have been a burnout survivor, in how to leverage emotional intelligence and some of the techniques to really mitigate or navigate and help people develop coping mechanism during these times. So what I'll be talking about today is why is it so important to help nurses and also students, as we heard, with these coping mechanisms, especially when it comes to students, because their levels of emotional intelligence tend to be on the lower side because of the age and lack of experience. But it is something that can be practiced and developed. So it's not something that is static or that is such as your IQ, and I will talk about it. I will talk a little bit, very briefly, about me to link it back with my talk here tonight. I'm going to talk about the EQI model that I work with, which is a scientifically validated model. I'm going to talk about how these triggers, how our mind and how our beliefs contribute to high levels of stress, anxiety, fear, and so on. And then from the model, which I'm not going to discuss in detail because there are 15 sub-markers, I'm going to dive deep into 3 of them that, in my view, are really important in helping healthcare professionals, and especially nurses, in understanding the concept and how they can actually exercise to have a more balanced level. And I have a small case study, which I would like to have a bit interactive with the audience. And if time permits, last year I did a very brief visualization exercise, which was much appreciated by everyone. And if there's time, I can do it again. Otherwise, we'll just stick to the case study. So this is what I have in store for today. Now, why am I so passionate about mental health in general, but really about healthcare professionals? Because as we have seen, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, there's always a surge in solidarity, right? We call them our angels, we call them our first responders. What would we do without them? But they're still running the marathon, right? And then the buzz goes down because there are so many systemic, there are so many organizational, there's so many issues that nurses struggle with on a day-to-day basis, and it's chronically. So there is not only, if we only already hear people like for myself example, I mean, or other people that complain that they are fatigued from lockdown or inside, cannot even begin to imagine what first responders or nurses are going through. So this is very emotional, right? This is very, because it's very easy to talk about it in terms of statistics, but when it comes to in terms of feeling, in terms of how does this impact their overall well-being at all levels, it's so important. And not only for the patients, but for the whole, global society. So I call them earth angels because honestly, I mean, to do the work that nurses do, and especially when we've seen with this pandemic, it's undescribable. So I wanted to highlight, I think everyone understands and knows this here, but I also want to say that it's to really think about it on in terms of feelings and on the burden and the stress and the care that they give unconditional to everyone else, but who cares for them? So what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily the system or on an organizational level, because that is ongoing, but some of the things that they can do themselves, right? Understand some concept that can be taught to students, but also practical self-care strategies for the nurses in action. Very briefly about me, I was already well introduced. What I'm actually now focusing on, and the healthcare sector is one of the biggest sector taken advantage of, is by cyber criminals, social engineering, right? Really preying on people's distraction, anxiety, fear, and especially in the healthcare sector, to infiltrate systems and then have acts of ransomware or phishing attacks, etc. So cyber criminals who use social engineering attack, they have very high levels of emotional intelligence. This is why it's so important to actually, when we teach people how to leverage and maximize their emotional intelligence, we can put them on a more equal footing, so they're less likely to fall prey to these attacks. And especially when we work with students or when we work with nurses, it's really important to, in my view, to also include these basic cyber hygiene, not from a technical perspective, but how they use emotional intelligence to get people to do what they want so they can infiltrate systems, extract data, and then they ask ransomware for it. I myself, 2 years ago already, it's already 2 years ago, I fell on the floor and I couldn't get up. And although my career path and my background is very different than in the healthcare sector, but I was depleted. Emotionally, physically, mentally, I was just depleted, right? It is an accumulation. So for me, that was a wake-up call that I need to do something else that gives me more energy and that is more in line with my life purpose. And how I've been doing this now for 2 years. And I think, I think we all have a vision, and really my vision sums it up. If we can live in a world where we put our heart in service of our mind. And what do I mean by that? Because I think we all know the most intelligent organ in our body is our heart space. It was the first organ to catch life in embryo, right? But because when we are facing a lot of stress, when we're facing a lot of pressure, when we're dealing with a lot of text and analytical information, that the part of our brain, I think Deborah referred to it perfectly, brain space and our attention span, it's very short. It's almost impossible, it's scientifically impossible to operate in our heart space at the same time as in our head space. So we react all the time, or most of the time, from our head space. This is why levels of empathy are much reduced. This is why perhaps when you see in hospitals, if nurses, between nurses or their colleagues or doctors, when there's so much pressure, right, there's no time to be in our heart space because we are really focused on our headspace. But this can drain people as well if we don't have emotional firewalls, as I call them. And I will go into more detail in that. I don't see the questions in the chat, but I will answer them later if that's okay. If anyone has a question during the presentation, just speak up because then I can hear you. This is my favorite quote that sums it up. And because we are all human beings, right, in the end, is that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And I really loved and was very much touched by the photo that was shown in the first presentation of the students smiling, right? Because I think people who go into this sector, people who go into this profession, they have high levels of social responsibility. They have high levels of empathy. They want to be in service of others. And although they don't ask anything back in return, as a basic human being trait, we all want to feel appreciated, that we belong, that we matter, that we've been heard, that we've been seen. And often, again, when we work in our headspace, we tend to forget about this. So I always bring up this quote to remember that in the end, it's you remember someone, how they made you feel. Did you feel better after you met them? This is what nurses do with patients, right? Not only physically, mentally, emotionally as well. This is the model that I work with. Some of you may already be familiar with it. So there are 3 schools of thought when it comes to emotional intelligence. There's Peter Salovey, who is the director of the Yale Emotional Intelligence Center. Then we all know Daniel Goleman, who wrote this best-selling book in the 90s about emotional intelligence. And this one is authored by Reuven Bar-On, a psychologist, and is really more for the professional setting, but allows people to actually survey and measure how someone rates on a scale, right, on a spectrum in all these areas. So you have 5 skills, how someone perceives themselves. This is the fundamental, the first part. How do they express themselves? How do you develop interpersonal relations? And this is so important, especially now when we have moved into an online working world, because the subtleties that we used to pick up on face-to-face, it's much more difficult now. And on top of all the technical difficulties, Wi-Fi is not working. Decision-making, right? How do your emotions influence the way you solve problems, you make decisions? And this is also very important when it comes in as nurses or any healthcare professions. You have to make decisions on the spot. And stress management, right? I think this is the biggest, how emotions influences stress management. I will go into more depth in self-regard, stress tolerance, and optimism in these 3, because these 3 are really from all 5. If I always say, don't start big, start small. So if you master, if we teach students also these 3 elements, it can already go a very long way. What is emotional intelligence, and how do I come with the analogy emotional firewall? So, well, first let me explain what emotional intelligence is. I have the definition here. So it's really emotional and social skills of how we perceive and express ourselves, and how we develop and maintain social relationships and use this information accordingly. When you define a technical firewall, because we are all working now in the digital world, is a system that controls access, what enters your network and what stays out. It's supposed to really get everything that is not good for the network, for your computer, at arm's length. So it's really controls access in the management system. You can use the same analogy for emotions. We all have emotional triggers that are linked to our beliefs, memories, past experience, or they're simply ignited or triggered because we work under chronic stress, right? And I will go deeper into that into my next slide. So when you have emotional firewalls, and if you use the same analogy, it's really being aware on what you allow, how you recognize your trigger, and not to react, but to respond, right? Often we react to situations if we have a lot of emotional triggers, and it can be different for different people, but then we react on the spot instead of really responding. Because when we react, we use that part of our brain that processes the emotion, and that is, you know, with all the unconscious bias, our mental models, our beliefs, our intuition, because it's called also the lazy part of the brain. It has shortcut mental models. It doesn't require a lot of energy to use, right? If we need to use the other part of the brain, our analytical part of the brain, learning new behaviors, taking in new information, it's really, you know, it's like gold. It takes a lot of, it's very important, but it takes a lot of mental energy, and we can only use it for a sustained period of time. This is why we always revert to mostly back to system one of the brain that is linked with the emotions. So I'm going to very simplify neuroscience here in a nutshell, and obviously there are some nuances to this. I'm going to try my best to simplify it as much as possible, but there are some, and I can send it at the end of my presentation, some resources of scientific studies. If you're interested in it, you can dive deeper into it, especially epigenetics studies is really interested in understanding this concept. We have one brain, but we have two parts of the mind, right? We have one mind, which is the conscious mind, which is responsible for 5% of our behavior. So I am using now 5% of my mind to pay attention to the words that flow out of my mouth. How am I representing myself? Am I making sense when I'm speaking? I'm really actively aware on what comes out of my mouth. At least I should be actively aware. If something else comes out of my mouth, then it's not my conscious mind. The other part, the other mind is 95% is your subconscious mind. This is everything you do on autopilot. This is linked to system one of your brain. Everything that is the way you dress, the way you, for example, when you used to drive to work, it's like you do it on an automated behavior. The way we have a count, you know, the alphabet to Z becomes something that we just, you know, can wake up in the night and say it. The way we brush our teeth, everything we do on autopilot. Now, why is this so important? It's because two things. The first thing is, on an average, we have about 70,000 thoughts a day, right? 70,000 thoughts a day, and only 5% are new. Now, what does this mean? Is that a lot of the thoughts that we have are old beliefs, or beliefs that we keep replaying around. And most of their beliefs, right, they come from a limited place, from a negative. And this is very important also for students, because, and I'm going to talk about the evolution curve, but a belief coupled with an intense emotion, and if it's a negative emotion,
but this lady's fantastic.
Oh, good. Turns into a long-term memory. It actually drives our behavior. So let me give you an example that you can make sense of it. When I was a young child, I had a huge phobia for mice, for example. Now, we all can say everyone is scared of mice. You see mice, you're rattled. But some people, they have phobia. So it's really intense fear. How did I develop this fear? Is probably as a child, I saw a mice and my mom or my dad screamed so loud that I had an intense negative emotion with that experience. So my mind in seconds of instant made it a traumatic experience. And from that moment on, whenever I go to a place that was unfamiliar to me, I used to scan the place a million times before I even would feel uncomfortable. And I would do it subconsciously because that intense emotion was triggered. How does this translate to other examples? For example, if you have a student that had failed an exam and that experienced an intense negative emotion with that exam, probably their fear of failure or their fear of wanting, to be perfectionism will take the best of them and will really drain them from their mental energy. Because when we don't overcome the emotion that is associated with the belief, this is what drains also a big part of our energy and exhausts us. Dr. Joe Dispenza, I don't know if anyone knows him, but he says it very perfectly. He said, when you overcome the emotion, then the experience becomes wisdom, because then you don't feel it anymore. So I did this myself. I've overcome the emotion. I'm still scared of mice, but on an intensity from 10 to 1, it's 4 now instead of 10. Right? And this is really important to help people understand that the emotional triggers that we have, so we can build this firewalls. And it takes effort, it takes practice on a daily basis in order really to be aware. So this is a little bit about how emotions are linked to the mind and to the thoughts. Evolution curve. So I tried to adapt it to the nursing sector. So these are fictitious people. I got them royalty stock free from Shutterstock. So no GDPR data regulation violation there. Between the age of 0 and 7 years old, that's when our subconscious mind is developed, right? So everything we are modeled from our parents, from our caregivers, right, is what becomes our conditioning, our truth. And a couple of things. So if as a child, for example, you experience something, whether it's traumatic, whether it's, in my example, the mice, or one of your parents has a certain behavior. As a child, the subconscious mind is not very much developed. So they often blame themselves for it without understanding how it actually happened. So they care, but they feel, obviously, right? The emotions are there. So they carry that behavior, right, or that emotions after long time into adulthood. Right? And this is why many people go into therapy to understand it, etc. But I'm not generalizing here, and by no means, but often it's the intense emotion we carry from what we've perceived from our childhood. I'm going to take myself as an example, not because I think I'm God's gift to the universe, but it's not to offend anyone. I grew up in a bicultural environment. So in the Netherlands, Dutch, very individualistic, and collectivist, Moroccan, Arabic. My mom, she always projected very low levels of self-confidence. This is how I grew up with, right? And a lot of the behaviors contributed to a low self-image that I took with me. Now, why is this so critical when you enter the academy or the workforce? Because that emotion that is coupled with your self-image, and we will go into that, drains you from your energy. You always second guess yourself. Have I done this right? Instead of really using your the functions in your brain for alertness, for focus, to focus on learning the skill, to focus on your patient. When you make a mistake, instead of seeing it as a mistake where you can learn from and do it better next time and not institutionalize it, right? It's a huge difference. But when we have very low levels of self-image, we tend to institutionalize experience with our self-worth, because that emotion contributes to it. And different children obviously have experienced different things in their childhood, but especially during this time, the formative years, is so important. How many times, me included, do we tell our children, no, you cannot do this. It's impossible. It's very limiting. This is why of those 70,000 thoughts a day, nearly 70% is negative thinking, right? Our brain is by default negative thinking, limiting, because this is how we grow up. And it's not right or wrong, but it's important to be aware of how we think, the beliefs, the perceptions that we developed, our maps of perception that then are linked with the emotions that drain us from our energy and increase actually our how we experience stress. Then you have between 7 and 14 years old. This is the time where one of the, we start modeling the personalities from one of our two parents, whoever we grew up with or whoever is around us, right? And I always tell people, it's not so much what you tell your children, is what they see, right? What they see and what you model as behavior. This is why it's so important as well to teach by example, to teach by practice, to teach by learning. But that also influences the child's personality traits as well. And their emotional cognitive evolution is still a work in progress, obviously. This is why their first heartbreak or their first rejection is felt so intensely. And if they don't have the coping mechanism with that, which emotional intelligence teaches, in that moment in their life, it can lead to the end of the world for them, because it's felt on such an intense level and they don't know how to cope with it. And again, how does this translate later on when you go into the formative of the school years or your business persona? If that emotion is linked to an event or an information or a memory, it will be linked, there will be a charge, and it will be one of your triggers. So whatever happens long further in life, when you're triggered with that memory or that experience, for example, if a teacher graded you very low and you're someone, the child is someone who is highly, performing, it will always be triggered if it has a lower grade or it's been given feedback that they institutionalized. And even if they don't want to, that emotional charge is there. Same thing for when between 14 and 25 years old. How are we, influenced? We look at how our values, our core values also developed. Is our environment, the school, the university, right? We look to our peers. And especially in this time and with the generation Z and the younger generation, it's a huge disruption for them, what happened with COVID and going online, right? Because already before COVID, it was already a struggle and the stress levels and with all the information and the exams, I mean, for any student. And now it's double. So I think it's not to be underestimated the levels of stress and burden that students cope with. And especially they want to perform well, they want to do well, they don't want to fail. Obviously this is not in our human nature. So it requires not only personal social toolbox, but also thinking educational culture and system on how do we foster. And obviously for the healthcare it's a bit more tricky and nuanced than that, because failure can lead to catastrophic consequences. But how can you create a safe space, maybe through simulations, through scenarios, that it's okay to fail and to learn from that failure. So when they do go into real life, that they're really well equipped, not only in terms of skill set, but they have the emotional toolbox and resources to deal with adversity, to deal with difficult patients, to deal with continuous high level pressure, etc. That is so important as well. And then between the age of 25 and 35 years old, this is the working environment. So when you are already a nurse and you are working in whatever hospital culture, but that will also influence the way they work and the way they perceive themselves and in relationship to others. And especially now, I mean, you all know the research, it's very grim. And I saw that this actually really surprised me, that not only is the occupational burnout under nurses rising, but it also increases the mortality of their patients as well. So it's obviously a serious dilemma. I'm going to use the definitions of the EQI model for the three markers. So self-regard. What is self-regard? Self-regard is the ability and tendency for yourself to like yourself in light of both your positive and negative qualities and still have confidence in yourself. And again, this is what I mentioned in the beginning, especially for students, right? If they have low levels of self-regard, how they view themselves, their self-image, it's going to impact the way they learn, the way they process information, the way they actually work with patients, because they're constantly, driven with that heavily emotional charge that they're not good enough or that they are not experienced enough, and which is normal. If someone with healthy levels of self-image understand that they lack experience, that they lack the information, that it's a normal trajectory in life to gain the information, to learn, to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes until you really master the skill set. It's for any human being, and not institutionalize it with how they see themselves. And this is really important. And if you look at the culture, right, whether it's the school culture or the academy culture or the hospital culture, when self-regard is valued, then it's welcomed that you act with pride and self-confidence. It's welcomed to have statements with, for example, achievements are noticed, they are praised, etc. It's really bringing that individual forward in part of the team, right? It's not in a narcissistic way or an individual way, but ultimately, again, people want, especially students, they want to feel valued, appreciated, and that they belong. When it's overlooked, it's one of the things that I hear, especially here in Europe, or also where I grew up, is when you're confident, you're arrogant, right? And I always say the difference between confidence and arrogance is humility, knowing that you're not better than anyone else and no one is better than you. And it's really important to help people separate that functions are different from identity. I always say we all go to the bathroom. We may have very different functions and different backgrounds and different lists of achievements, but we, at the end of the day, we're still all human beings, and the core essence of humanity is the same. And I think it's really also, especially for students, to remind them of that to not correlate their function with who they are as a person. So this is when self-regard is valued and when self-regard is overlooked. And obviously, again, in every organization culture, it's nuanced, but it's important to think about this aspect as well. What values do we want to teach? What values do we, as a school or as a hospital, hold for our staff? Stress tolerance. So the level of how much you're able to cope with stress. And here I'll use an example of an exercise or a study that was done by Yale University. And they had two groups of people who they put in separate rooms, and they had the same videos with the same images, but a different wording. And it was images related about stress. So group A, let's refer to them as group A, they had a video with images where stress was portrayed as negative. It's bad for your heart disease. It can lead to reduced performance. You make mistakes. You lose this, you're distracted. You lose focus, etc., etc. The other group was shown the images in the video with more positive annotation of stress. You get higher performance. You're better on top of your game. It's really good for your heart rate, etc., etc., whatever they said. Then they went away and they followed them for a few weeks. And what they noticed after 5 or 6 weeks, that the stress hormone, cortisol, was much higher with group A than group B. So and they did several studies. What does this tell us is that the way we perceive something is influencing how our cells respond to that. So when you already have a negative understanding of stress, this will play into your experience. And for example, if you are obviously overloaded and you have many patients and you are working around the clock, when you tell yourself, you're confirming that because that's your reality. When you say, I'm always exhausted and it's always busy, it's very difficult. These are words that actually send signals to your brain and cell that amplify the experience. So what I always teach people is to alternate to the words, like, to say, most days it's difficult, right? Sometimes I feel overwhelmed. And obviously, it's very personal and tailored to the situation because some people are always overwhelmed. But the most important words we will ever speak are the words we speak to ourselves. This is one part of the story because the other coin, which is we should not underestimate, is chronic stress. Right? Chronic stress is a real issue, and people are really succumbing to chronic stress. And there needs to be obviously solutions and coping mechanism on a systemic level, but on a personal level, often we think when we exercise, we allow the stress to exit our body, which is true. How do you allow emotion to access your body, right? And this is very important because emotion is energy in motion. And if you're someone who grew up, and I don't want to make this gender specific, but if you someone grew up who was told, don't cry, be strong, it's not, or not showing your emotions or even processing your emotions, we don't know how to do that. And then we really, suppress them and we feel them in all our body, and they cause all kinds of unhealthy side effects, including in our work. So when people don't know how to even feel their emotions and allow it, like it's normal, that when I was at NATO, I mean, can you imagine? It was a very high level stress environment and very patriarchal environment. So I always used to go to the bathroom and I cried a lot, and then it was out, and then I was at my best peak performance. So I really welcomed it for myself. I knew that if I felt something very strongly and it need to go out, so I did it in my full privacy because I didn't also want to show others. But it's so important to teach actually people, men and women, that allowing your emotions to go out is so important. I do it with my child as well when he's angry. And then he, like every child manipulators, they try to blame me. I said, no, you are the one who's feeling the anger. So I teach him creative ways to express and channel that emotion, whether it's hitting his pillow, whether it's drawing, whether it's allowing him to scream in his room, until he calms down. But it's really important that we help people understand that there's no right or wrong when it comes to emotion, and that the behavior is important. The consequences of our emotion is in our control, but find ways, and even creative ways, in channeling it. So I don't know if this is already done in the nursing academies, but to really teach them as well. For everyone, it will be different. How can you help people channel their emotions? Because as soon as it's out, stress levels reduce. This is why peer-to-peer groups is so important. This is why when people experience high levels of stress, and just the fact by talking to someone or holding someone in their arms, or having that human connection, can already significantly reduce the stress. Humor, Deborah mentioned humor. This is so important. There's so many studies that show that when you have humor in your work and in what you do, it increases the happy hormones in your brain, dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, and it really balances out the cortisol levels. So these are all ways to reduce not only the perception, what we have about stress, what we tell ourselves, to make it realistic. If we there's a difference in saying I'm always exhausted to sometimes I feel tired. It's already different how we experience it. This is again some of the EQ model definitions when stress tolerance is valued and when it's overlooked, right? And it's important again in any organizational culture to understand how do you perceive stress? How do you value mitigation strategies? What are you modeling as well, right? I think having core organizational core values is one thing, but what I also always in NATO learned, if it's not modeled from the top to the down, right, then you create all kinds of frictions. And the third one is optimism. And this is so important. And some people tell me, well, Nadia, life is not always kumbaya, and positive thinking is overrated, because when I've, cannot see my family for 5 weeks and I'm working around the clock, how can I be optimistic? And here is what I give always an example, is that the difference for me between positive thinking and optimism is acknowledging your reality, acknowledging the emotions that you feel, acknowledging the current situation, and knowing, right, going through it, and knowing that this too shall pass, that everything is in forward movement, right? When we tell ourselves that this is our reality and this is what will stay forever and this moment will never end, this is when we create what I call, not what I call, but what Dr. Martin Seligman refers to as learned helplessness. Martin Seligman is the founding father of positive psychology, and he wrote a book about this, about optimism and learned helplessness, is when people believe that life happens to them, right? That they focus on everything they cannot control. And this is really key. When we focus on what we can control, and everything else that we can't control, there's already an energy shift. There's already an emotional shift as well. It's really teaching people. This is what, for example, I'm going to take myself as an example. When I lost my father a few years ago, this was unexpected and it was a very traumatic experience. Now, in that moment, seeing him also die, that I told myself that how can you survive something like this? Well, people die regularly, so still it's a very traumatic experience and people experience it differently. So in that moment of time, what I didn't allow myself, because I didn't have the wisdom then that I have now, is to really feel right, whatever it was coming up, the negative emotion, the anger, and there are models of grief transitions, and knowing that this is just a moment in time. And when I look back, right, that moment actually propelled me in so many other things. Also with COVID, right, a lot of people, they are succumbing to the pandemic burnout, as they mentioned, or to the exhaustion, because their focus is the current moment in perpetrating. And here is where visualization comes in. And when I say, and some people say, I don't visualize, I cannot visualize. I say we are all excellent visualization, because everyone knows how to worry. Worrying is expecting the worst case scenario. Worrying is expecting the negative emotions. Now, when we turn this in a scientific way, and there's a body of emerging science about visualization and the impact it has on your neuroplasticity of the brain, is when we worry and we add to the stress, we ignite and we increase our negative emotion, right? Because the negative thought is also triggers negative emotions, which increases our cortisol levels, increases our amygdala part of the brain. The amygdala part of the brain is the almond-shaped part of the brain that regulates fear, anxiety, control, anger, etc. And it really gets heightened. We go into survival state, into fear state, which takes up a lot of energy. However, when we use the same technique, but we replace it with positive emotions, when we help people visualize beyond that moment and the process of getting out of there, because they don't have a mental model on what's in the future. We only have a mental model of what happened in the past. This is why we keep repeating the same behavior, because what we know may be painful, but it's familiar. Everything new, we don't know. So it takes time to get used and we go through all these emotions. But when you help people visualize new potential outcomes and how they have the resilience and the grit and the coping mechanisms to get through it, the subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between reality or what's happening in your mind. So that emotion feels real. If you close your eyes right now and you think about a past event that was negative in a certain way, you will feel those negative emotions. If you think about a happy event, you will feel those happy emotions. And this is really important. This is where people are using it, for example, for athletes to increase their level of success. They use it for learning. Studies also show the percentage increase, actually, how they retain their information. Because it's not only anymore about the cognitive ability, about memorizing or learning the information, but also our emotional state and the mindset, and how our emotions, when we experience something that is unfamiliar to the brain, causes uncomfortable emotions. And when we don't have coping mechanism to navigate those uncomfortable emotions, this is when we really go down the rabbit hole and we amplify levels of stress, anxiety, etc. Right? It's not about eradicating them, because that's not realistic, and that's not what we as human beings are supposed to be doing. I mean, we are supposed to feel also negative emotions, but how can we help people with coping mechanisms to navigate those emotions? This, again, in terms of organizational culture and value, is when optimism is valued. And I just recognized a small typo. It's valued, not values, so apologies. And when optimism is overlooked, right? And again, it's really important, I believe, in whether it's in an academy or in a hospital culture, is how do we look, how do we have systems in place that help the nurses with increasing their levels of optimism? Because when you're in the moment, right, no one has the capacity to actually be optimistic, right? They're really focused. But it's so important to what you tell yourself, how you replace the negative emotion with a neutral emotion, so you don't go into survival state and you're just really focused in that moment, and have, in addition to all the mindfulness or meditation, but also like I said, the self-image, the self-regard, what we tell ourselves, and how we give that human connection support to each other. This is the interactive session. So again, she is fictitious. She is from a royalty stock-free photo. And as an example, as a case study, right? So Jane has very high levels of empathy, high levels of social responsibility. So empathy is really being mindful and understanding the desires and needs and emotions of other people. Social responsibility is how much you do for others for the greater good. So often, I assume people who go into the healthcare sector or in the nursing sector, they have high levels of empathy and responsibility. And Jane in particular always goes above and beyond for others. But because she has low levels of self-regard, right, it's really weighing heavy on her, and she feels more and more depleted because she grew up in an environment, in a family where others always came first. So she was never modeled or taught that it's okay to take care of yourself so you can take care of others, when we see in planes. And her life is getting worse and worse because she doesn't know any work-life balance. Self-care is not working. Happiness are all strange to her. So how can she, what are some of the things that she can reframe her self-image, build emotional firewalls, and rewrite her stories? What are some of the things, based on what you heard me talk about for the last, I don't even have the time, 30 minutes or so? What are some of the things, and based obviously on your experience and working with them, what are the things that she personally can take action on to turn this around?
Positive self-talk.
How would that look like, for example? How would it look like if I mean, because they go through very traumatic and stressful experiences, right? And especially during COVID. So what are the things that she can tell herself? And I'm actually really interested myself to hear from you, from the expert who have been in this situation as well, who work with these people.
I may be saying that she did her best despite the outcomes or whatever's going on around her. She was able to perform her best, not necessarily looking at the outcomes that the patients are maybe suffering or she's losing patients, but she is doing her best.
Very, yeah, very good. This is a very important point because there are two elements to this, right? It's the element A, understanding that if you lose a patient or you go through a very stressful traumatic experience, it is normal to have these heightened emotions. It's normal to feel these negative emotions and to go through them. And then the second part, to what you just said, not institutionalize it or correlate it with her as her self-worth, right? To really, when she has gone through the emotions, to then say, okay, from a skill perspective or from a learning perspective, what can I learn from this? Is there something that I could have done better, right? Not going on a guilt trip or shame, but understand how can I use this for the next patient or I think it's also learning people. Right? We learn machines. When we look at AI, they learn new stuff and we reprogram to unlearn. It's the same thing for human beings and not correlated with who we are self-worth. Self-confidence is a muscle. You have to train it, but not that it's very normal to have those emotions, and B, when you're rational, when you've gone through it, what can I learn so I can improve my skill set? Because I obviously in any profession, it's important to improve and stagnate and be, apply critical thinking and challenging yourself so you can always strive for excellence, especially in the healthcare sector. But I think this delinking is so important.
Nadja, we have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, this is my last slide. So if anyone wants to pitch in,
I will.
Yes.
This is Robin Glaza. I think we're just reiterating what you had said about allowing those emotions out, not keeping them all inside. So whether that means she needs to go and, like you did, cry somewhere, but even just that peer-to-peer groups and talking to each other. Because I see that so much now with my nurses who are working in COVID units, and especially my new nurses and everything they've experienced, all the death. And it's like that peer-to-peer support is so very important, but not to keep it in, but to actually talk about it and, and all the trauma they've witnessed and been through. So I think that's important.
Exactly. And it will be interesting to see how this is evolving in the culture, right? I think not only for the healthcare sector in any organizational culture, but how do we include emotional expression or intelligence in our organizational culture so people can learn to build these firewalls, can learn to have this coping mechanism without feeling guilty, without feeling ashamed, without feeling that something is wrong with them, right? And this is so important. And especially when you're young and you're getting into this field, I think one of the biggest misery in the world is that a lot of people feel that they're not enough. So they need to do or, do something so that they can feel enough. And this is something that will never come from outside. It really has something that you need to create within you.